charged with inciting subversion of state power for co-authoring Charter 08, a declaration calling for political reform, greater human rights, and an end to one-party rule in China that has been signed by hundreds of individuals throughout the country. On December 25th, Liu Xiaobo was sentenced to 11 years in prison. In North Korea, the communist regime continues to deny all basic freedoms to its citizens. According to reports, any person who expresses an opinion contrary to the position of the ruling party faces severe punishment, and so do their families. There are reports of severe repression of people involved in public and private religious activities through imprisonment, torture, and executions. In Sudan, the regime of Omar al-Bashir continues to kill thousands of innocent people with impunity. On November 24th, 3 prominent human rights defenders were arrested in Khartoum and tortured in custody before being released. Amnesty International considered the 3 to be prisoners of conscience, detained solely because of the peaceful exercise of their rights to freedom of expression and association. In Zimbabwe, elections were followed by a wave of human rights violations that resulted in at least 180 deaths and at least 9,000 people injured from torture, beatings, and other violations perpetrated mainly by government forces. About 28,000 people were displaced from their homes. In Burma, Nobel Peace Laureate Aung San Suu Kyi, who won the 1990 elections there, but those results were ignored by the military junta, and she has been imprisoned since that time. She should have already been released, but 2009 sham trial extended her imprisonment and indicates that the upcoming 2010 Burma elections will be a farce. In Venezuela, the government response to those Venezuelan citizens protesting against the Chavez regime shutting down independent media outlets is to denounce those using Twitter and text messaging as terrorists. Police firing tear gas at students and a call for government supporters to prepare for battle. In the midst of all this, President Hugo Chavez welcomed into his ranks a high-ranking Cuban official, Commander Ramiro Valdez, to address the energy crisis in Venezuela. Valdez doesn't know much about electricity, but knows how to set up the repressive apparatus of a totalitarian police state, which he did in Cuba 50 years ago. In Cuba, the dictatorship continues to systematically deny Cubans their human rights. Cuban blogger Yoani Sanchez, mentioned here at the summit last year, was abducted by Cuban state security and beaten up to stop her from attending a performance art happening in Havana celebrating nonviolence. On Human Rights Day, government-organized mobs assaulted the ladies in white as they marched for the release of Cuba's prisoners of conscience. At least 24 Cuban patients died of exposure at Mazorra, a government hospital, in January of this year. And when Amnesty International prisoner of conscience Orlando Zapata Tamayo initiated a water-only hunger strike to demand that prisoners be treated decently, in December of 2009, prison officials responded by taking away his water for more than 2 weeks when he was already extremely weak, trying to break his spirit, and failed, but contributed to his death on February 23rd. Regrettably, the chief international body charged with protecting human rights is failing to live up to its mission to stop these and other abuses. The Geneva-based UN Human Rights Council has acknowledged in a recent report by 17 of its 47 member states, supported by Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, and the International Commission of Jurists, falls short in its handling of country situations, in the efficiency of the process involved in highlighting violations, and in its reactivity to crisis situations. Strong politicization of the Council, driven by block-based voting patterns, has led to inaction in the face of atrocity and abuse. We saw this sad spectacle last week within the Council, first with the Secretary General of Iran's High Council for Human Rights denying the documented and rampant instances of torture, executions, and mass detentions of Iranians, followed by the Cuban Foreign Minister's speech, who, echoing his Iranian colleague, also denied Cuba's horrible human rights record, and to add insult to injury, went on to blame the United States for the death of Orlando Zapata Tamayo, as well as slander the deceased Cuban prisoner of conscience. Little wonder that the March 1st magazine issue of Newsweek contains an article titled "The Downfall of Human Rights." The article highlights Freedom House's report, Freedom in the World, released in January, and reveals a global decline in political freedoms and civil liberties for the 4th year in a row, the longest drop in the almost 40 years that the survey has been produced. In his 1986 Nobel acceptance speech, writer, activist, and Holocaust survivor Elie Wiesel issued a challenge not only to activists, but to people everywhere, challenging us all when he said, quote, "I swore never to be silent. Whenever and wherever human beings endure suffering and humiliation, we must always take sides. Neutrality helps the oppressor, never the victim. Silence encourages the tormentor, never the tormented. Amidst all the documented evils of the past year, there is hope. The rise of citizen journalists, social networks, Twitter and cell phones, able to document those atrocities and show them to the world, is a response to Elie Wiesel's challenge. We've seen its impact across the world. This meeting has a focus on internet freedom, and it's necessary because authoritarians recognize this technology as a profound enemy to maintaining monopoly control over information, which for totalitarians is a pillar of their power. New opportunities exist, and human rights defenders need to brainstorm and collaborate to improve activism and to offer a counterbalance to the collaboration and coordination of repressive regimes and movements. The international stage can be used to put a spotlight on the world's worst abusers. We saw it this last week when 30 NGOs from this summit called on the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights to intervene on behalf of Cuban human rights defender Nestor Rodriguez Loaina, barred by the Cuban dictatorship from attending this very meeting. The Cuban ambassador protested loudly when Hillel Neuer of UN Watch raised the matter in an interactive dialogue with the High Commissioner. But Nestor, on the other hand, was grateful that you spoke up for his human rights. The Geneva Summit seeks to offer dissidents and human rights activists from around the world a global platform and forum to share their personal struggles, their fight for freedom and equality, and their vision for how to bring change. This past week, we saw with action how it can be done, and how much it upsets those who would prefer that we remain silent. Let us make sure that the victims of human rights violations receive the solidarity of people of goodwill, and that the abusers be given cause to be shamed by their actions and to change their ways. Thank you very much.